know many of you will remember Paul Harvey. He used to have this Monday through Friday radio program, and beginning as a part of Newscast, he had this bit that he would do called The Rest of the Story. He started that during the Second World War, and then it premiered as its own separate radio series on ABC radio networks in 1976. And the rest of the story consisted of little-known or forgotten facts of history on a variety of subjects, with some key element of the story withheld until the very end, usually the name of the person that was involved in whatever story that Paul Harvey is telling. And then at the end of the broadcast, Paul Harvey would always end with the tagline, "And now you know the rest of the story." Well, today we sort of get the rest of the story on Jacob's family. And this is sort of like what you often see at the end of some movies, when they have these postscripts telling you what became of some of the characters in the movie. Well, that's sort of what we're going to do today. We're going to sort of be going through a jet tour of Genesis 48 through 50. So let's start here in Genesis 48 and verse 1. Sometime later, Joseph was told, "Your father is ill." So he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, along with him. Let's skip to verse 5. "Now then, your two sons born to you in Egypt," this is Israel talking, as he is known now, "before I came to you here, will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Any children born to you after them will be yours, Joseph. In the territory they inherit, they will be reckoned under the names of their brothers." And Joseph took both of them, Ephraim with his on his right toward Israel's left hand, so Ephraim is on this side, and Manasseh is on his left, or is on the other side towards Israel's right hand. And he brought them close to him, but Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head. Now, normally you do the blessing like this. Each boy on each side, this is the boy on my left side, this is the boy on my right side. I'm going to bless them like this. But that's not how Israel did it. He did it like this. He crossed his hands and put his right hand on Ephraim's head. So Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head, though he was younger, and crossing his arms, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, even though Manasseh was the firstborn. He was the oldest. When Joseph saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he was displeased. So he took hold of his father's hand and he moved it to Ephraim's head. And Joseph said to him, "No, father, this one is my firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused. He said, "I know, my son, I know. He too will become a great people. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations." He blessed them on that day and said, "In your name will Israel pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. So Jacob gives the firstborn blessing to the younger of Joseph's boys, just as been done several times in the book of Genesis. Isaac is selected over Ishmael, even though he is younger. Jacob is selected over Esau, though he was younger. Joseph is selected over Reuben, though he is younger. This is actually the 5th time in the book of Genesis that the younger sibling is chosen over the older sibling, if you factor in Cain and Abel. In adopting Manasseh and Ephraim as his own sons, Jacob was also giving Joseph a double share of the inheritance. These two grandsons would each receive a full share along with Jacob's other 11 sons. Now, some of you may be wondering, okay, well, if Jacob adopted Ephraim and Manasseh, doesn't that bring the 12 tribes of Israel to 14? Well, to further complicate matters, I don't know if you're aware of this, there are 3 different passages in the Bible that list the tribes of Israel, and each of those lists is different. In Genesis, we have the original sons listed, but Levi is not listed on every list. Dan is not listed on every list, and Joseph is not listed on every list. In Numbers, we have a different listing of the 12 tribes. In Revelation, we have yet still another listing of the 12 tribes. So it's apparent that the tribes were rearranged at different times to constitute the 12. The number is always 12, but what constituted the 12 apparently would change. Levi is not given a portion of the land in Numbers. That's when they're dividing up the land, because it was the priestly tribe, and they were given 48 cities instead, and they received tithes from the other tribes. So in order to divide the nation into 12 sections, someone else had to come in to substitute for Levi. Therefore, in the Numbers list, Ephraim and Manasseh substitute for Joseph and Levi. Jacob said Ephraim and Manasseh would represent Joseph's double portion. So in essence, the Joseph tribe is divided into the two tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh in the book of Numbers. Well, that explains the Numbers list. Well, what about the Revelation list? Here in Revelation, we're given the 12 tribes of Israel, 12,000 from every tribe. But Dan and Ephraim are suddenly not mentioned in those tribes. Why not? They're not mentioned as part of the 144,000. And suddenly the Joseph tribe makes a reappearance. Now, Dan is believed to be left out of the list in Revelation because it was the first tribe to enter into idolatry. And some believe that the Antichrist or the false prophet mentioned in the book of Revelation actually comes from the tribe of Dan. We'll discuss why they think that later. Ephraim mixed with other nations after the Assyrian invasion. And so there may not be any pure Ephraimites left in order to constitute a tribe because they mixed with the Gentiles. Joseph and Levi are then reintroduced to keep the number at 12 tribes. Why it's really done, we don't really know, if we're being completely honest. All we know for sure is that it's always divided into 12 tribes, and the rest is speculation. Right, Genesis 49, verse 1. Then Jacob called for his sons and says, "Gather around me so I can tell you what will happen to you in the days to come. Assemble and listen, sons of Jacob, listen to your father." And he begins with Reuben, his firstborn. "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power, turbulent as the waters. You will no longer excel, for you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it." So he describes Reuben's descendants as they're going to be characterized by instability and unreliability. They're a turbulent tribe. You will no longer excel means you will no longer be preeminent. You will no longer have the rights of the firstborn. And the reason is, for you went into your father's bed. Reuben slept with his father's concubine wife, Bilhah, who was Rachel's handmaiden. And she is the mother, actually, of the tribes of Dan and Naphtali, or Naphtali, depending how you want to pronounce it. Two of Reuben's descendants were later become the leaders of the rebellion at Korah. So obviously that's an evidence that they're a turbulent tribe. They're challenging the authority of Moses and Aaron. And the book of Judges records that the Reubenites did not heed the call to fight the Canaanites. Now he moves on to Simeon and Levi, and he says in verse 5, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council. Let me not join their assembly, for they have killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they please. Cursed be their anger, so fierce, and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. So when he says Simeon and Levi are brothers, he means more than simply the fact that they're physical brothers. He means that they share the same traits of violence, anger, and cruelty. And we know from having studied the life of Jacob now, that Jacob has in mind the time when the two brothers destroyed a whole town of Shechem because one man from that town sexually assaulted their sister Dinah. So Israel says, I will scatter them. fulfilled when Simeon's descendants were later assimilated into the territory of Judah and shared territory with the tribe of Judah. If you look at a map of the tribes of Israel, you'll see Simeon is in the middle of Judah, and Judah is surrounding it. So it sort of becomes unimportant tribe because Judah is such a more prevalent tribe, and so Simeon sort of loses some of its distinction because of its where its land area is. And the reason that I think that God scattered Levi and Simeon is to prevent them from ever being tempted again to be a tribe that gave in to anger, gave in to violence, gave in to cruelty. And I know some of you are wondering, well, if that's the case, well, then why did Levi later become the tribe of the priesthood? Shouldn't the Shechemites, that incident with the Shechemites, have precluded that Levi, that would be the tribe, that they would become the priestly tribe? How do we explain that this curse that we see here, it turns out sort of to be a blessing later on? Well, I guess the best way to explain that is sometimes God just decides he's going to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. The scattering of Levi did come wrapped in this redemptive blessing. It does seem strange to us that Levi is selected, but if everyone is equally undeserving of the blessings of God, the choices that God makes simply reveal his necessary grace. Verse 8, Judah. Judah, your brothers will praise you. The name Judah means praise. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, O Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs. And the obedience of the nations is his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. So here Israel says, Judah, you're a lion's cub. This is a symbol of strength and sovereignty and courage. And Judah, the tribe of Judah, is often pictured as a lion in later times. We see it in Ezekiel, we see it in Micah, and especially in Numbers 24. Of course, Judah's greatest descendant is going to be Jesus Christ, who is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah in Revelation 5. The scepter will not depart from Judah, Israel says, until it comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nation is his. Now this is sort of a difficult area to translate. The verse has traditionally been understood as messianic. It was initially fulfilled in David, but ultimately it's fulfilled in Christ. In other words, Israel predicts the Davidic kingdom and the messianic kingdom, and that David will have someone to sit on his throne at some point in the future. This sets the tone of David reigning and incorporating the nations of the Gentiles into his benevolent empire. And this thing is repeated almost verbatim in Ezekiel in chapter 21, in a section where Zedekiah, who is the last king of Judah, is told to remove his crown because dominion over Israel or Jerusalem is going to be given to the one to whom it rightfully belongs. That's Christ. Verse 13, Zebulun will live by the seashore and become a haven for ships. His border will extend towards Sidon. This tribe is actually landlocked. It's not actually on the seashore. So it's kind of interesting prediction here prophecy here by Israel. What happened is Zebulun was close enough to the Mediterranean Sea, about 10 miles away from the Mediterranean Sea, that they controlled the major trade routes to and from the sea. So that's how they lived by the seashore and became a haven for ships. They sort of controlled that coastline even though they didn't actually live exactly on it. According to 1 Chronicles, this tribe, Zebulun, produced 50,000 skilled warriors who were loyal to David. Verse 14, Issachar is a raw-boned donkey lying down between two saddlebags. When he sees how good is his resting place and how pleasant is his land, he will bend his shoulder to the burden and submit to forced labor. Well, Issachar settled down, learned to be content with what they had, and apparently was gifted with wisdom, as King David had advisors from Issachar who was said to understand the times in which they were living better than other men and other tribes. It also indicates that like a donkey, unfortunately for Issachar, they will be forced to work for others. It's unclear, to be honest, what situation is actually being referred to there. Then we get to Dan. Dan will produce justice or provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. And you remember Samson came from that tribe. Dan will be a serpent by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites the horse's heels so that its riders tumble backwards. The name Dan is a play on the Hebrew word to judge or to vindicate. Now, this is where people think that maybe the Antichrist or the false prophet comes from the tribe of Dan, because it says Dan will be a serpent, which the serpent we typically associate as a reference to Satan. And the Danites were the first to enter into idolatry. They were very treacherous. Some of their treachery is described in the book of Judges, where they were completely unprovoked. They decided to attack a city that was living in peace and prosperity, for no other reasons other than that they could do it. He's also described here as biting the horse's heels. So the description of Dan as a serpent and a heel biter has caused some to draw the conclusion that this is a hint, again, that the Antichrist or the false prophet will come from this tribe. It's speculation, but that's what some people think. In verse 18, he says, I look for your deliverance. Oh, I forgot to forward it, sorry. Look for your deliverance. This is just a quick prayer that Israel throws up before he continues. Verse 19, he says, Gad will be attacked by a band of raiders, but he will attack them at their hills. Most of the tribes were west of the Jordan, and the tribe of Gad was east of the Jordan, so they were more vulnerable to attacks because they are separated from the other tribes by the Jordan River. They particularly seem to get attacked by the Moabites from the south. Verse 20, Asher's food will be rich. He will provide delicacies fit for a king. Their land had very fertile farmlands. It was near the Mediterranean, and it ensured their prosperity. So they got to be a tribe that was wealthy. Verse 21, Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. So Naphtali is apparently the granola crunching, Birkenstock wearing hippie tribe, as far as I can ascertain. All the people of that tribe had coexist stickers on their camels, and perhaps this is a reference to they maybe just had a very independent spirit. They were isolated. They lived in the hill country north of the Sea of Galilee. You know, mountain folk. They're kind of weird. I mean, just talk to Steve after the service. Anyway, so verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful vine nearing a spring whose branches climb over a wall. Now, fruitful there is a fruitful vine. Why does it say it twice? It's actually a pun on the name Ephraim, which means double fruitful, whom Jacob predicted would be greater than Joseph's other son, his firstborn son, Manasseh. Branches that climb over a wall, this is a reference to the fact that Ephraim's descendants tended to expand their territory. Eventually, they become the dominant tribe of the 10 tribes of the north. So much so that sometimes the 10 tribes of the north are simply referred to in the Bible as Ephraim. With bitterness, verse 23, archers attacked him. They shot at him with hostility, but his bow remained steady. His strong arm stayed limber because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you with blessing of the heavens above, blessings of the deep below, blessings of the breast and the womb. Now, with bitterness, the archers attacked. This may be sort of a reference to the fact that Joseph, was pushed into slavery by his brothers. He survived their hostile attack. He was protected by God's providence. Or it could be an acknowledgement that expanding one's territory, which they were prone to do, caused people to shoot at you with hostility because they didn't like you expanding your territory. Nevertheless, God protects the tribe through the blessings of heaven and of the deep, meaning the soil watered by the rains from above and the springs and streams from below. And it benefits both breast and womb. It benefits the fertility of men and animals. Verse 26, your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains and the bounty of age-old hills. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. Joseph is the prince among his brothers because Israel gave him a double portion, so he had the greater blessings. Verse 27, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, in the evening he divides the plunder. So the tribe of Benjamin was really sort of a warrior tribe. We see this in the book of Judges, and we see it with Saul and Jonathan. They were from this tribe. There are multiple examples in the book of Judges, chapters 19 to 21, of the savagery characterized by some of Benjamin's descendants. They're a feisty bunch. The Apostle Paul comes from the tribe of Benjamin. Verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them, and he blessed them, giving each blessing appropriate to him. Now, you may be wondering, some of those didn't sound so much like a blessing. But a blessing was simply when the father prophesied what the future of your descendants were going to be, even if those were not the way you really would have liked for those blessings to have turned out. Verse 33, when Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up in his bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. And then in Genesis 50 and verse 12, so Jacob's son did as he commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had sought as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite along with the field. So today we conclude our study of the life of Jacob. So I thought it might be helpful for us to remind ourselves of some of the truths we have learned along the way in our study of Jacob. And we first meet Jacob in chapter 25 of the book of Genesis. And he is born grasping Esau's heel, which foreshadows that Jacob is going to be a self-will conniver who is always scheming to find a way to take advantage. And later in that chapter, he manipulates Esau into giving him the birthright for a pot of stew. In Genesis 27, Jacob deceives his father in order to get Esau's blessing. And this chapter seems to highlight the will of man and the sovereignty of God. Because in that chapter, what we find are 4 extremely self-willed people. 2 of the people, Isaac and Esau, are trying to avert God's will. God had told Isaac that Jacob was the one who was going to get the blessing, that he would be greater than Esau. And Isaac is trying to stop that from happening by giving the blessing to Esau secretly. So Isaac and Esau are trying to avert God's will, and 2 of the other self-willed people, Rebekah and Jacob, are trying to assure God's will happen. But rather than trusting in the Lord, they're trying to assure it by their own cunning and their own scheming. They're just trying to out-scheme Isaac and Esau. Along the way, what each one discovers is that there's a price you pay for doing things your way. There's a high price to pay for self-direction. In fact, Rebekah's greatest fear was that she would lose her family, and after that incident, none of those 4 people are ever in the same place together ever again, the rest of their lives. In Genesis 28, Jacob flees from Esau and Isaac because Esau is going to kill him. And in that chapter, we learn that what is often true in our world is that crisis precedes change. For most of us, we will not change unless a crisis of some kind forces us to make the change that we're usually reluctant to make. Most of the changes in our life happen at some point of crisis. A crisis is most often brought into our lives by our own messed up choices and reaction to our circumstances. And God allows us to experience a crisis because it is only at the point of crisis where we first begin to recognize that we have a problem that exceeds our abilities. And you won't learn that there are greater resources, that you have greater resources that you can imagine, until you learn you have greater needs than you know. When all of his dreams appeared to be vanishing, God gave Jacob a dream of reassurance. Sometimes it takes the collapse of our dreams to discover God's dream for us. And also, that chapter is about the nearness of God, even when we're unaware of it. Jacob says there, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. There are many times in your life where the Lord is in that place and you are not aware of it. Now, Jacob, his focus is on the place. He thinks, oh, Bethel is the place that provides a gateway and access to God. And I, as I told you when we were in that chapter, don't believe that that is the point God is making. I don't think the point that God is making to Jacob is, yes, Jacob, there is a stairwell or a ladder that reaches down from heaven to this place, Bethel. What he's trying to tell Jacob is, Jacob, because you are my child, there is a stairway or a ladder that goes from heaven to you. Not to that place, but to you. And wherever you go, Jacob, the gate of heaven goes with you. My angels descending and ascending, bringing your prayers and petitions to me and providing my answers to you. So the dream is really about the nearness of God. In chapter 29, Jacob meets his favorite uncle, Laban, who is his scheming, conniving equivalent in every way. In that chapter, we considered whether Jacob's experiences with Laban were poetic justice, Jacob just getting his just desserts, or was it still an example of God's prevenient grace? Prevenient grace means the grace that goes before. Some view the events of this chapter as God getting even with Jacob by allowing him to reap what he has sown. Others prefer to understand the sequence of events that happens there as God's prevenient grace going ahead of Jacob to instruct him, not to punish him. Perhaps it is a both and situation rather than an either-or situation. Maybe God's prevenient grace is somehow being manifested in a way that looks to us like poetic justice. But whatever the reason, Jacob needed to be humbled at his point of perceived strength. And his point of perceived strength at that time was his cunning and his scheming. And so God allows good old Uncle Laban to come in and out-scheme Jacob and get the best of him. And so God used Jacob's antagonistic relationship with Laban to shape and to motivate him in ways that he otherwise would not have been shaped or motivated. And this is why God brings difficult people into our lives. They serve a purpose. I have come to the realization that God often sends difficult people across my path to reveal to me that I'm not nearly as spiritual as I think I am. And Jacob learned things about himself by having to deal with Laban. In a way, you could say Uncle Laban was sort of like a mirror that God held up to Jacob, and in essence is trying to teach Jacob, hey, this is who you are apart from me. You are just like your Uncle Laban. And without the Labans of life, we would never even consider some of the important questions that need to be asked. Also, we find there the gracious gift of Leah when we get to chapter 30. Due to the fact that we live in a very romantically oriented culture, most people read the story there, and it's a great love story of Jacob and Rachel. And we find ourselves, if we're not careful, rooting for Rachel and sort of ignoring Leah, or maybe even rooting against her. Yet, a more careful examination of that chapter and what God is doing reveals that God's main purpose was to bring Leah into Jacob's life, not Rachel. How do we know that? Because Leah, not Rachel, would become the mother of half the tribes of Israel just by herself. She was the mother of Judah, who was to be the heir through whom the Messiah would come. She is the mother of Levi, through whom the priestly tribe would come for the 12 tribes. Leah gives birth to half of the 12 tribes of Israel. Leah and Jacob are buried together as husband and wife in that cave at Machpelah, just like Abraham and Sarah, and just like Isaac and Rebekah. Rachel is buried on the way to Bethlehem. She's not in the family burial plot. So Jacob might not have chosen Leah, but God did. In Genesis 30, we also see Jacob's flocks increase. He becomes prosperous, although Jacob does not yet understand at this point in his life that God is blessing him for God's purposes, not for Jacob's purposes. And one of the purposes of God in blessing Jacob is so that Jacob becomes a blessing. And God blesses Jacob simply because of who he is, not because of what he does. How often we simply prefer to be blessed without consideration of how to use it to become a blessing to someone else, or we assume we're being blessed because not of who we are, but because of what we do. In Genesis 31, Jacob flees from Laban, and once again, his tactic is deception. Even though Jacob continues to be self-reliant and self-directed, he always sought God's protection. He never sought God's direction. God still graciously protects Jacob and his family, even when they are egregiously defecting from God. Why is God faithful in those circumstances? God is faithful because we're not. So he has to be. Therefore, in spite of Jacob's patchy and lackadaisical obedience, and Rachel had stolen her father's foreign gods, God still graciously protected them, even though they were in the midst of being self-willed and self-directed and sinning. And you have to wonder why. Why did God do that? Because only the undeserving get grace. That's who grace is for. Only the undeserving get grace. We also observe that Rachel tried to serve the Lord, I suppose in some way, while still clinging to her idols. And I think that's the problem with some of us. We try to live in both worlds. We have idols that we cling to in our own way. And Rachel's dependence upon those idols was really not any different from Jacob's own dependence upon his own skill in scheming and his cunning. See, our main problem as believers, we think our main problem is a sin problem. Your main problem is not a sin problem. That is not your main problem if you're a believer. Your main problem is a trust problem. That's why you sin. In Genesis 32, Jacob prepares to meet Esau upon returning to the land. He wrestles with God. Upon entering the land, the Lord allows Jacob to see this invisible world of angels encamped all around him. It's there to give Jacob assurance. Hey, I'm here. I got you. I'm going to protect you like I always have. And yet, Jacob still seems to place most of his trust in the tangible gifts he sends ahead of him to offer to Esau as a bribe, rather than rely on the sovereign, invisible protection from God. And here's the thing. What you rely on in life, that's what you really trust, no matter what you say. You can say you trust the Lord all you want, but if you're not relying on the Lord, you're not trusting the Lord. What you rely on is what you really trust. And Jacob, during this period of time, he is solving a problem that doesn't exist because he's anxious over a scenario that isn't going to happen. He's doing all of this because he's convinced himself that Esau is going to kill him. When we get to chapter 33, Esau does not kill him. Esau forgives him and welcomes him. So Jacob is doing a lot of things unnecessarily. And I've wondered in my life, how many times have I done the same thing? In my fear, I become anxious over a scenario that does not exist. But emotionally, I feel as if it has already happened. So I worry and I fret about how to solve this problem that doesn't even exist except in my imagination. And usually what we find, it is in some way tied to our guilt about our past and our anxiety about the future that causes us to have fear in the present. In wrestling with Jacob, as I mentioned when we were in that chapter, I believe God was trying to reveal to Jacob his stubborn self-reliance. The Lord quite obviously could have overpowered Jacob at any time. However, he doesn't do it till they wrestle through the night. And when he was done messing around, all he had to do was touch Jacob's hip socket, which is important in wrestling, and it dislocated. So why did the Lord bother to wrestle with Jacob through the night? Why didn't he just do that at the very beginning? He didn't do it to reveal to Jacob his strength. He didn't do it to reveal to Jacob his tenacity. He did it to reveal to Jacob his stubbornness. In Genesis 33, we learned about forgiveness and releasing resentments when the two brothers unite for the first time in 20 years. And ironically, Esau is the better example in that chapter. And we talked about forgiveness and how an unwillingness to forgive imprisons me in the past, steals my joy in the present, gives me little hope for the future. Apart from forgiveness, the dreadful sins of the past continue to devour the present and affect the future. In Genesis 34, Jacob leaves the part of Canaan where God had called him and crosses back over the river. He lies to his brother Esau and says, hey, I'll meet you on down the road. And then he goes back in the other direction. Why? Because Jacob is always restless about the will of God. He can never rest in it. And so he felt safer being self-directed. And because he felt safer being self-directed, he never would allow himself to rest in the Lord's providential sovereignty. And you and I will always feel restless until we rest in God's providential sovereignty, because real security is never the absence of danger. Real security is the presence of God. And so Jacob faced a real danger because he was trying to live outside the boundaries. He's trying to be close to where the Lord told him to go. He's only 30 miles away. Isn't that close enough, Lord? I know you told me to go to Bethel, but Bethel, I can almost see it from where I am. It's just right over there. Only 30 miles away. And what Jacob didn't realize is that he was never in greater danger than when he was living outside the boundaries of God's will, no matter if he felt safer. And if he felt more in danger being in God's will, that's the place he was never safer than when he was in the center of God's will. What happened to him while he lived there for 10 years near Shechem? He starts to get assimilated. He agrees to this deal to marry his kids to their kids, and we're all going to be one big happy family. That is not God's plan at all. And so the world is betting that it can assimilate you before you can influence it. And it never has a better chance of assimilating you and your family than when you choose to live outside the boundaries of God's will. In Genesis 35, we observe Jacob finally course correcting in order to step into obedience. He had to step away from his disobedience, in particular, his sins of omission. What were his sins of omission? He had allowed idolatry to take root in his family and in his household. And God has him return to Bethel, where 30 years later or earlier, he had revealed himself to Jacob through that dream. A big part of Jacob's course correction was to return to that place where God had originally revealed himself to him. Jacob's life was and is a testimony to the grace of God. And although God in his sovereignty used him, it nevertheless appears that Jacob on many occasions unnecessarily complicated his life by leaning on his own understanding and trusting in his own resources. At the moment, I can't think of a single time in the life of Jacob where he ever hurried to obey the Lord. And yet, at the end of his life, what do we find? Israel worshiped as he leaned on top of his staff. This is the end of his life. This is the first time it says Jacob worshiped, is at the end of his life. I think Jacob, near the end of his life, became more reflective. He got weaker, obviously, physically, could not depend upon his resources like he once had. And I think maybe near the end of his life, he finally begins to, for the first time, really depend upon the Lord. From chapter 35 to the end, he's called Israel more than he's called Jacob. Though as a younger man he had built altars and set apart certain monuments, he is never described as worshiping or praising God until this moment just before his death. And when you get to the Hebrews chapter, the Hebrews Hall of Fame of faith, it's this time in his life that is mentioned. Nothing earlier than this. At the end of his life, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. Perhaps there's significance in the way that that is described to us. Israel worshiped as he leaned. He'd finally learned to rest in the will of God. He was done with pursuing his own direction. And all it took was a mere 147 years. That's it. Only took him 147 years to get it. But notice, he's still rewarded for getting it when he got it. Someone has said, God chooses what he allows us to go through, but we get to choose how we're going to go through it. So whatever is going on in your life right now, whatever God has chosen for you, how are you choosing to go through it? Are you like me? I so often seek God's protection. Lord, please protect my family, protect my kids and my grandkids, and protect Kelly and I, and protect the church, and protect. I don't spend nearly as much time saying, Lord, direct me, direct my family, direct me and direct my grandkids, direct. I don't. Because like Jacob, I like safety. How about you? Are you only seeking God's protection, but not so much God's direction? If God calls you to some place that you feel unsafe and uncomfortable, are you resting in the providential sovereignty of God, knowing there's no place safer for you than being at the center of his will? The story of Jacob is about how the perfect grace of God works through the imperfect life of Jacob. And the perfect grace of God can and will work through your imperfect life in the same way. The only remaining question is, how long will it take you to get it? How long will it take you to learn to lean as you worship? Amen? Amen. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Praise team can come forward at this time. We have prayer partners in the back there to pray with you and for you at this time. If you find yourself in need of prayer, if the Spirit has spoken to you this morning and brought something to light that you believe you need to talk to the Lord about, they're there to help you do that. The rest of us, let's join together as we consider now the life of Jacob. Lord, what a great story the story of Jacob is, because it's so much a story about your grace. I mean, all the Bible characters, it seems they're undeserving of grace. Some come across as being a little bit more undeserving than others. And Jacob sort of strikes us that way. And yet we should be encouraged by the fact that even in his imperfect life, in his up and down, back and forth kind of faith journey, you were there with him as you had promised him there at Bethel. I am with you, Jacob. I am for you, Jacob. And we have that same privilege today. In the Gospels, it's revealed that Jacob's ladder or staircase is actually Jesus. book of John, it's revealed that Jesus is that bridge between us and God. And Jesus had promised his disciples, as he has promised us, and I will be with you always. Whether you recognize it or not, whether you feel it or not, I am there with you. Are you there with me? It took Jacob a lifetime to learn his lessons. And I don't want to speak too disparagingly of how long it took Jacob, because the only thing that matters is that eventually he got it. Eventually he understood. And when he did, he leaned and he worshiped. Lord, may all of us gathered here this day lean as we worship now. We pray this in Jesus' name, and all God's people said.